Welcome to Cocktails and Crime Analysis. My name is Charlie Gibberti. I'm joined, as always, by Jason Elder. Cassie Langdon's on vacation with her family, so I don't know, she might be fired. We'll have to discuss her future whenever she gets back. But today we are really happy to have the authors of Rethinking Thought, a practitioner's guide to critical thinking and intelligence analysis with us, Randy Stickley and Akshata Kumavat. So for our guests, we'll start out with the ceremonial first question. Well, Randy, we'll start with you. What are you drinking?
Well, I am actually working with an old-fashioned made with a relatively new whiskey I found called Creek Water.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Are you a traditional old-fashioned guy, or do you like little twists on it? Do you like ginger old-fashioned and smoked stuff?
I'll do the smoked. That's about as adventurous as I'll get. I don't do what they call mid-century old-fashions, which are the ones where people muddle your cherry and your orange in there. I typically stick with what they would typically call an 1880s old-fashioned, which is your simple bitters. I like to use both Angostura and walnut bitters, black walnut bitters to be specific, and then a twist of some kind of citrus. I prefer lemon.
Randy, I gotta tell you, man, I've been drinking old-fashions for like 10 years. I've traveled the world. I have just learned more in the last 30 seconds of your intro to this podcast about the nomenclature of old-fashions than I've learned in the past 10 years. Mid-century, I had no idea there were terms for this.
Yeah, I mean, that term itself came from total historic diatribe. Back when old-fashioned started, it was a breakfast drink for, snobby farmers, and it was gin.
Oh.
But, yeah.
Oh, God.
But then, come the 1850s, when you had the growth of Sazeracs from your bartenders and what they call coquetiers in New Orleans, that's where they think the term cocktail comes from, but there's still a lot of debate around that. But they put, your fruit in there, some absinthe, and then by the 1880s, with, ice becoming a little more available to bar folks, they take all that stuff out of there, just give me something that's simple and old-fashioned, and that's where, the 1880s, 1890s version of the old-fashioned came from. That's the one that I've stuck to forever.
Okay, well, forget the book. We're talking about this for the rest of the show.
Love it.
I think that we should definitely bring back the old-fashioned for breakfast tradition. That needs to come back in America.
That was gin and nutmeg, man. Ugh.
Well, we can leave out the gin. That's fine. Some traditions need to stay dead. Yeah.
Yes, they do.
And on the other side of the podcast, the Akshata Kumavat. Akshata, I'll ask you, what are you drinking?
Well, I'm just going to stick to a decaf coffee for this afternoon because I'm just recovering from my delivery period. I had a baby a month ago and she's been exhausting me, but at the same time I can't have caffeine, so a simple decaf for me will do well.
Yeah, we want to say congratulations on your first one, too. The pictures are absolutely
Charlie.
Adorable. We're thrilled for you, and thank you for taking time out of being a mom to come and talk to us about the book.
Thank you very much.
All right, so the title of the book is Rethinking Thought, which is a thought-provoking title. And so I kind of want to ask you guys, where was the origin of this book? At what point did you say, hey, I think that we have an idea that needs to get fleshed out, needs to get printed, and actually needs to be a book?
No. AK, what would you say? I mean, our partnership kind of grew from a presentation, but I think it was that first year we presented together in Vegas. That would have been, 2023?
I agree. That was 2022, actually.
Was it 22? Okay.
No, I think you're right, 23.
Either
And,
time is irrelevant after those.
Yeah. Well, we started off with just discussing biases, and it all came from the inspiration from reading Psychology of Intelligence Analysis. And this was when I was preparing for my C&CA exam. And Randy and I didn't even know each other before that. And as we started reading, talking about it, I realized there's more depth to this subject, and it has somewhere been buried in all the other literature that came out on intelligence. And people focus so much on the technical parts that there's little focus on the critical thinking that drives these technical parts. And hence, the first presentation comes out. Next year, we plan to do another extension because Randy came up with more on the subject. And then we combined together to infuse more practical themes into the subject, because of course there's plenty of theory out there, so we wanted to share with the audience on how can we combine this into a real world experience. And then that led to the second presentation in 24. And then, Randy, what would you say was the driving factor for the book?
I remember we sat there, and I'm going to paint a scene for everybody here. AK and I had formed a professional friendship just over discussions about the C&CA exam, but after our second presentation, I think we had, AK, like 350, 400 people attend our,
Wow.
presentation. Yeah, at ILEA in 23. It was a big crowd. But we sat down, we had a celebratory drink, and I was hoping, AK, that you were beyond the exhaustion phase, because I wanted you to explain to them what tequila and tonic is, because that was a new one to me. Sat in a bar in what is that, the Horseshoe now, and I had a celebratory cigar. We were sipping on tequila and tonics, and we started talking about a paper. And the more we discussed it, the theory's there. The theory is one thing. I think we all had to read book after book, paper after paper about the theory of critical thinking and why it's so important to intelligence work. But when it comes to the rubber meeting the road, I found there was a big gap with how people process. Well, critical thinking is just one half of the analytic process. Well, it is. It's foundational, but there's a lot of complexities that we really don't flesh out to newer analysts, or even those ones that come in with a plethora of knowledge and experience that, quite honestly, they're not seeing the practical application. They're seeing the highbrow academic theory, the study about the study. So that's something AK and I started kind of chewing the fat on, so to speak, and before you know it, we had, I think, mentally like 4 chapters outlined. Just here's what we want to talk about, these practical approaches.
Yeah, and then followed by that, I guess just applying and failing multiple times taught me a lot more in the practical scenario, because this is such a sensitive topic which requires that confrontational, debatorial kind of exercise that not everyone digests it well, right? Especially in a professional setting, there are so many strong opinions in the room, so much of rank experience and all that. So that's why I use the word failing, because I feel like the more number of times that I have attempted to do it, it has taught me more different number of ways on how to make it work. Because every single time one method with that one person doesn't work, and especially when supervisors are changing positions and they get moved from different assignments, now you're dealing with a whole new personality. So there's a unique aspect to critical thinking. It's not tied to the role you play, but it's tied to the personality you're dealing with. That's how you can reason. And that's how different ways of biases, different ways and techniques of inducing that into your work came in. So that's what I wanted to write about, because as a newborn analyst or an experienced analyst, everyone has to go through that test rigorously. Because it's easy to read a book, apply the methods and get the work going, but it's more difficult to navigate these soft skills. And it's like a work of art, trying to debate and trying to convince your person with an argument. So as a prior experience as a litigator, I'm used to convincing different judges and attorneys and senior counsels on why the case needs to be strong or argued in a certain manner. And I kind of honed in on that experience while I was writing this book, and also kind of applying it where I work.
It's so impressive that you went from 2 90-minute training sessions to a 300-page book, and so that's really in 2 years. It's really impressive that there was that much meat on the bone. There was that much that you obviously got excited about, and the more you talked about it, the more that there was there to digest and critically think about. So I guess in the beginning here, I'm curious to know, do you both consider yourself writers? Was before this project, was this, have you, certainly how much of writing had you done prior to this project?
Well,
Go ahead.
for me, I don't think that I had done anything as a writer before, except for just maybe LinkedIn articles here and there, and that's about it for me. And then papers in your university, but everyone does that.
Yeah.
I think everyone's trying to write the next like Faulkner piece whenever they're in college, so I don't count that. But I'm with AK. I did a lot of LinkedIn articles. I did some writing for different periodicals throughout, early parts of my career. And then when I was in college, beyond the academic writing, my school, Fairmont State, go Flying Falcons, they had a political science newsletter called the Knowlton, which, some folks use that as a gateway to getting into journalism. Some of us that were trying to get into the intelligence field use it as a way to write objective pieces, situational awareness kind of things. But I try to keep up with it because I think sticking to purely the objective technical writing aspect, AK and I have probably written and reviewed thousands of products just between she and I. And that's two different shops at two different, stages and levels of the intelligence field. So you can imagine it gets kind of X plus Y is Z when it comes to technical reports. But authoring something that, one, you're passionate about and trying to remove yourself from that objective mindset, it is challenging. And like AK said, I think she put it perfectly, it is almost like doing something in artistic sense. You have this thing that you're so passionate about, you want to cram every bit of knowledge and every bit of that passion into it, but at the same time, you don't want to be redundant, you don't want to repeat yourself. So that's why I'm really glad that when we wrote it the way we did, we kind of set the scene each time. I think AK, we even had somebody who, in their feedback from the beta reads, said it almost reads in the format and the formula of an intelligence product. We state the problem, we give the facts, we give our interpretation, and then we close it with kind of that.
You're right. Yep.
So you talk about, everyone wants to talk about this sort of in an academic sense. And when I was reading at least the first couple chapters of the book, it read very much like a research methods textbook because, of course, research methods are all about removing potential for bias so that you can look at your results and you can be confident that bias didn't influence them, right? And you used some great examples, the Abraham Wold example from World War II of the planes getting shot and which ones actually made it back, and sampling bias I thought was really neat. But you emphasize you use the term pracademics in the beginning, that you want to talk about how the rubber meets the road. So I'll just ask both of you guys, Akshata, in your experience at Hamilton County, and of course, Randy, your experience at the National Targeting Center, can you give us an example of a time where the rubber met the road for you, where you were able to sort of change the direction of the organization, or maybe just an operation or something tactical, with a critical thought avenue that nobody else had brought in before?
Sure, I'll go ahead before Andy.
Sure.
So I'd like to highlight one thing though here, that because there are so many different pieces moving together at the same time, there's no single investigation happening, right? So I'll lay down the scenario as there are many cases that may have the common elements together, or say common offenders between them. For example, if there are certain offenders that a drug specialized unit is pursuing, that same offender may have networks into another offender that the investigative unit is looking at for, say, catalytic converters. So this is the perfect scenario where you're trying to blend facts from two separate sections where there are two silos of information, but you're trying to match them in such a way that supervisors and investigators from both sections can see what is going on with each other, so that you get the whole picture. But not only this, even in terms of auto thefts, right? We are typically looking at just the locations, looking at the number of times a certain vehicle was hit. And many often what happens is the offenders would go and scale these neighborhoods first and then plan their offenses and get back. So when you're looking at auto thefts, despite after putting up all the graphs and the maps together, you have a whole new set of questions to ask. Like, when are they going to hit next? Or for example, for the analysts to go and repeatedly check the evidence from the investigator's portfolio, or talk about charges, talk about what types of the prosecutor is going to look at, which articles were stolen. These kind of questions actually ensue more efforts from the investigator as well as the analyst that make us combine multiple facts together. So that is in case of the auto thefts and residential burglaries. Now, one more incident we had was with like the drug unit was looking at a certain offender who had contacts with this one female who was out at patrol, and she, like the patrol division looked into her, and they had been collecting a lot of information on her. But then she was also kind of the plug for the same offender that the drug unit was pursuing, but they had no idea for years. And so having both of those two pieces connected gave them a whole new look on how to interview the offender that they had caught, and then also go after that other female over there. So these are the practical ways that we could do. But at the same time, I'll say, because every supervisor thinks differently operationally, and because each time that we bring these types of discussions in, there's also protocol that matters in an agency. So when their experience and protocol can only do certain things, for example, they won't allow the analyst to directly interview the offenders, right? It's a sworn-in role that can do that. So an analyst can only frame those questions and pass those over to the investigator, and only he gets to ask those. So that's the key difference between the types of questions also that the investigators ask versus what the analysts have. So to try and get the gap closed between, okay, the investigator may ask the offender questions which are only to draw out the facts because they want to prosecute that offender, but the analyst asks the questions from the point of view that they want to understand the crime, they want to understand the mind game and the entire network of these offenders, because they won't stop at just that offense, right?
Yeah, we see that a lot in the financial intelligence world, because there's always like a sworn side that is pursuing charges and interviewing people, but then there's also an analytical side that's always just looking at money. And so if they never communicated, then those sworn guys would go into those like suspect interviews and they'd ask, where were you, when were you, why did you have this on you? But as the analyst who's trying to put this bigger picture of flow of funds together, asking like, the suspect's girlfriend, oh, hey, that's a really pretty watch, where'd you get that? Well, that might just sound like small talk, but actually it's a really important piece of this puzzle of where did all of this money go?
Right.
And who wound up being the ultimate beneficiary in this scheme. So, yeah, that resonates quite a bit. Randy, so your role is a little different. You're actually not at a local police department. You're at can you just kind of explain what the National Targeting Center is and maybe a time that you interjected critical thought?
Yeah. So the National Targeting Center actually, like many of the intelligence shops post 9/11, grew, off what happened on September 11th, and it is a DHS CBP building, but it serves as basically a giant federal fusion center. Fusion centers are, part and parcel to the Homeland Security kind of infrastructure here in the States. Very big for state, local, tribal, territorial law enforcement to partner up with these agencies. But what makes the targeting center so fascinating is that everyone has a seat there. I mean, I'm, on a contract side of things, so, I help lead a team of folks that are from the company side, but you do have many folks that come into this mindset and come into this center with one thing in mind, and that's why I'm really proud of. I was just talking to my dad and my uncle last night about, this very topic, about, what makes it different than any other shop I've worked in, is that it is truly a collaborative environment. Like, yes, you do have those folks in there that carry a gun, and they're, I think all of us have either worked with or heard the stories about the schism between the operational folks and the analytical folks. And more often than not, the operational folks tend to think they got things a little more on check because they're seeing things from the field, but they're usually jumping to a quick assumption, and it takes some of those analysts sitting in the background to lend a little more gray matter to it. Not saying their initial assumptions or postulations are incorrect, but more often than not, you're dealing with limited data, and you're not necessarily seeing the full scope. Actually, one of the things, Charlie, that I wanted to hit on is actually, as AK was talking about this, and I'm sure you saw me on camera, I was doodling back here. While I before I joined the Targeting Center, before my time with NW3C when I worked with them, I actually helped run a small narcotics shop in West Virginia that focused on opioids, narcotics, related crimes. And one of the things that really kind of took the stance that AK was really going with here, we have, I'm sure if you're familiar with any part of West Virginia, I'm sure it's Morgantown, where WVU is, one of the biggest universities in the state, Big 12 school. Really disappointing to be a fan this past season, but I'm going to look past that. But you have a university where I think at 2 times a year you have between 40 and 50,000 people that just clamor in for football, for basketball, for education. It's a really big hub. And we had a significant amount of folks, particularly around 2018, 2019, where you had actors, players from Detroit, from Columbus, from Georgia, mostly from the secure threat group or gangs, if you want to call it that were coming in and setting up shop. Now, in many other parts of the country, we know, particularly in Chicago, for example, people from the People Nation and people from the Folk Nation do not mix. They do not do business with each other. Or, Crips and Bloods, they're killing each other in Detroit. There's all kinds of nuances. But I started seeing images. I remember doing one of my scrubs on social media where, I saw these particular 3 emojis that were being utilized in a lot of correspondences. Now, any other place, and I'm hoping the handicap sign came through because I'm a terrible doodler, but that is used in your cryptology and cryptography of gang analysis that denotes Crips. And then you have your Star of David, which is your gangster disciples, and then you have your Big Red B, which is your Bloods. Many of these officers set it aside, or many of the task force folks set it aside as like, dumb kids being dumb kids. Well, I would go into these meetings and I would assert myself and say, well, look, why is it we have such a big population, a lot of kids coming in with disposable income, you have a big gas industry at that point in time, many folks come into the region with a lot of disposable income. Why do we not see such widespread violence? Why do we see any fight for territory or claims of certain regions or certain parts of Morgantown as, this is my turf, don't sell here? It came to my realization after doing social media analysis, financial analysis, that I had to start asserting that, look, they realized, they being these 3 particular gangs, realized they were going to make a hell of a lot more money with all of these kids, all of these college students running around with disposable income than they would killing each other in the streets. And I'm not saying Morgantown was perfect. We still had a random killing here and there related to, a Columbus set or somebody from Detroit. But it was never long and drawn out. It was quick. It was succinct. And they weren't really paying attention to that. They were letting their own confirmation biases get in the way of, well, this is just how it's done in Detroit. This is how it's done in Chicago. So it has to be done that way here. West Virginia, particularly Morgantown, is its own kind of amorphous blob, if you will. I mean, it was kind of the opioid overdose, capital of America at one point in time. We have a crippling kind of socioeconomic structure that's going on here. I love my state to death, even though I live in Virginia now. But it is hurting. And you have these folks that realize with that vacuum of that socioeconomic bubble, they can come in, they can set up shop, they can do their business. And many law enforcement agencies just kind of borrowed the template of what's going on in other big metro centers. You couldn't treat it like that. You had to treat it like it was his own creature. You had to look at the patterns. You had to look at different aspects, gather all of these sources. That's very part and parcel to what, all of us, I'm sure, have done in our careers. But you really had to sit back and lend that gray matter because just because somebody with, the gun in the field said, hey, it's happening this way, it came out it wasn't so. Had a lot of arrests, a lot of successes that came out of that just by knowing, hey, so-and-so from the Gangster Disciples may be working with someone from the Bloods out of Detroit or out of Columbus. But we had to make sure that we understood that because if you treated them as hostile contenders with each other, you were going to treat it as a war zone. That's not what it was. I almost saw it as if you know anything about geopolitics, Dubai. Dubai is this kind of neutral zone where businesses of all kinds, businesses that may be adversarial with one another, they all go and use it as a playground or maybe some kind of business haven. So started treating Morgantown as such, led to a lot of successes just by using that critical aspect rather than just going with that initial confirmation bias.
Let's talk about applying the book and its concepts to law enforcement, and maybe make a pitch why somebody should study this and use the concepts of the book. What should their why be?
Well, I can tell you one of the biggest whys from my perspective. I'm really big on definitions and making sure that words matter. Jason, you and I have had this conversation a couple different times about words mattering in our discussions. However, if you look at the Latin name for humans, Homo sapien, there's different definitions of it. Some people think it's clever man, some people see it as thinking man, but it involves some use of gray matter to help navigate our way through life. And I won't get on the big soapbox about why it's important to go back to that. But the biggest why for me is we would be doing ourselves as a species, but also ourselves as professionals, to not necessarily sit back and think, okay, am I really thinking this, or am I just kind of going along with a party line? Am I sitting here and thinking about something from my own perspective based on a smattering of facts and figures and data that I have access to, versus just kind of latching on to that first theory? AK and I poured a lot of our experiences, and I'm so appreciative to have her as a co-author, a partner, a colleague, a friend, because I make jokes all the time that if I have to buddy up with a lawyer, something's gone wrong. So to have someone who has that legal mindset, that interpretive mindset to go along with her intelligence experience, versus me, who this has been my bread and butter since May of 2013, it really does make itself more apparent that you need to have that skill set about you. So I would say that's my biggest why. I'm sure AK has one, maybe a little tangential, a little varied, but that's my biggest point here.
I 100% agree with Randy on everything he said, and I'll add that in applying critical thinking, it's unique and it's rare to that individual's mind and to that individual's perspective, because each one of us are exposed to the same set of facts and incidents that happen. We all read the same reports, we all deal with the same databases, but it's that person's mind that uniquely is capable of asking those specific questions.
And if I could just dovetail off of that, AK's heard me say this term and phrase so many times, she's probably going to leap through the computer and beat me with something if I say it again, but we talk about tools, we talk about databases with regard to doing this job that we all do so well, but tradecraft is not going anywhere. The abilities and comprehension of the human mind, that's what makes us so great. That's what, she said it, it's our superpower. So I'm a firm believer in, let's make sure that we're fortified, bolstered, whatever adjective you want to use, but it all plays into tradecraft over tools. I am a student of open source. Open source has been my bread and butter since the beginning of my career. I have talked with many vendors, many folks that have become colleagues and peers, but there's always a new tool. There's always a new kind of widget that's going to help you do the end-all, be-all analysis. But the bulk of that analysis and that critical thinking, it's done here. It's not done with a tool. It's not done with, a chat GPT prompt or whatever other tools that people may be trying to use. So definitely want to emphasize that one of those whys is tradecraft over tools.
So I mentioned earlier that I kind of very early on in the book drew the analogy between what you guys were talking about with biases and research methods. And we should kind of define that. When we're talking about biases, a lot of times people think about gender bias or racial bias or something like that, but we're talking about ways in which errant thinking might leak into the intelligence process.
Yeah.
And so in a research methods context, they refer to those as threats to internal and external validity. And it's been a minute since I've taken my grad school research methods class, but I think I remember at one point I had to memorize like 20 threats to internal validity or something like that. And as I'm reading the book, you guys mentioned there are 200 identified psychological biases. And like when I read that, I was like, bullshit. And then I started like going into what each of them were, and I Googled it a little bit, and I got to admit, all right, you guys probably do actually know what you're talking about. So good on you for writing the book. And then those 200 biases break down into 4 categories. So Akshata kind of already mentioned this, but so Randy, I'll just ask you, if I'm a police chief or I'm a leader of an analytical unit, and I don't have time to read this whole book, but you could hit me with 2 or 3 biases that are most common in law enforcement that you see the most often that we should look out for. What would those 2 or 3 be, and how would you go about addressing those? Do it in 10 words or less, please.
Yeah. Confirmation. Je pense donc je suis. Just run amok. That's self-actuating, making something out of nothing. Definitely see that a lot within agencies. One that I wrote down, availability bias. That's another big one. That one deals a lot more with vividness of image. Many folks, and I'm definitely on the younger side of, professionals in this field that are now in leadership capacities, but I will tell you, our generation, millennials, Gen Zs, and so on, we are very vivid image based. I use this example with Jason. If you were to think about something mentally, versus a car crash versus a shark attack, a very visceral shark attack, which one do you have a quicker image of?
The shark attack?
Probably the shark attack, because it's something unpredictable, it's vicious, and we also have umpteen million, media pieces from Jaws to Sharknado and so on, showcasing how bad that is. But how many fender benders, car crashes happen, by the second in this country? So that's another one. But I would also go into groupthink. I cannot underpin how important it is for us to understand critical thinking needs to have a little bit of that creative thrown in. Some ideas are good to throw out there, but groupthink can lead you down that path of fallacy quicker than anything, because other folks may have their biases, may have their preconceived notions. We've seen examples of this through history. I mean, the Iraq WMD debacle was definitely one of the biggest examples. But we also have an example, I think it came out of Harvard or Yale. I forget which one of the Ivy Leagues it was, so I'm not trying to attribute complete blame here. But they put a bunch of historians in a room at one point, and they said, the United States is governed by a vampire conspiracy. Find it. They didn't say, does it exist? They didn't say, can we find this? They just said, find it, disposing that idea is there. And I think after a couple days, they eventually figured out, yeah, there may be. So that's a little more troubling that they figured it out. But nonetheless, groupthink, availability bias, and confirmation bias are probably my biggest 3.
Can I just real quick ask one more question to kind of connect that to something Akshata said earlier? So groupthink. I learned a very hard lesson early on in my career. I was working with a new department, fairly large department, and in my first day or 2, I created some analysis that looked at ag assault in the NIBR's definition of the ag assault category, which is 13As. And there are a whole lot of local and state statutes that contribute to 13As, and what I saw was that over the years, ag assaults had gone way, way up.
Right.
And when I mentioned that to a room of police officers, the very first thing all of them said were drive-bys, gang-related drive-bys. And they were telling me about how they're addressing it, and they've created this really robust gang unit. They've got 6 guys, 7 guys, whatever it was, full-time, doing nothing but following up on these drive-by shootings, and they've got NIBIN, all of which are things that I think are good things to do. But it started with this supposition that ag assaults were being driven by drive-bys. So the next time we got together, I put together a chart, and it showed like a breakdown of all the ag assault categories over time. And drive-bys were like that, and domestic violence was like that. It was massive. And we had all these resources for drive-bys. We didn't even have a DV victims advocate at the time. And so I mistakenly thought that I was going to go in there and correct their groupthink bias, and they were going to applaud me, and they were going to say, thank you, Charlie. We're really glad that you brought this to our attention, and we're now going to operate more effectively and address the much bigger problem and divert resources. And to my great shock, that was not their response at all. It was, honestly, I after the dead silence faded, it was almost as if I had called all of their mothers fat. They were very angry. I didn't realize at the time, but in identifying this bias, I had touched on something very personal. And Akshata, you touched on this earlier. Like, it has as much to do with the problem you're solving as the personalities that you're dealing with. So, as an analyst, how do you navigate that? When you come into an organization, or you come into like a team, or even just talking to an investigator, and they are so gung-ho this way, and then you do an analysis and you're like, well, actually, I think we should be this way. How do you navigate the human emotions that come as part of being told that you're wrong?
Well, couple of things, and they also are very optical in nature as well as they are personality driven. Optical because, to start with, if an analyst is singularly presenting in a room full of rank experience and past knowledge, it would always fail because you have 10 against 1, right? So having an analyst paired with someone, or having an analyst's boss there, or at least someone from within the investigative unit who gets along with the analyst to advocate for and on behalf of them, helps to resonate the same message. Because let's face it, right? You have 15 some investigators in the section, and out of which only 2 or 3 would actually come to you to do real business because they get you, right? You can't always win everyone, right? So you tend to use those 2 or 3 to sing the same song as you are when you are in their room. So this is the first optical illusion here. Second one is that when an analyst is presenting, it requires a great degree of patience and articulation of their own facts, but as well as trying to understand what the investigator is saying. Because the worst thing all of us hate, no matter who we are or where we come from, is to be misunderstood. An analyst would hate it as much as the investigator, and so on. So, to try and alleviate those tensions in the room, it's important to first, instead of speaking, to actually hear what the other person's saying, so that you get to then say, well, I heard you, now it's your turn to hear me, right? So it's easy to show that sign of mutual respect, where it's important that both perspectives are on the table, but they're respectfully and professionally put forth, that there's nothing personal in them. Then there's also the theme of regulated discussions, that when there is a head of the unit present at the briefing, right, they know how to interact with their teams better than how the analyst should be interacting with a member of their teams. So having this person in the room, kind of like a mediator, really helps, because when there are members from their team trying to object to something that the analyst is saying, or to interject, or to misjudge, or to just pick up a word and go off on another tangent, because that happens all the time. They won't let the analyst finish. They won't let the analyst finish articulating, so they're trying to already defeat the purpose by misunderstanding and arguing. So this mediator can play the role of, okay, let's come back to base and regroup and rethink on the same subject. And this person also helps to ask those questions to the team member, like, okay, well, have you tried this out? If you haven't, then give it a try before you jump to that conclusion that it's not going to work, right? So having someone as a diffuser really helps. And at the same time, when there are already stressors in the room, such as like I mentioned, if they would just pick up your word and misinterpret it, it really helps to put facts on a piece of paper, on a presentation, or those whiteboard kind of concepts, where as the analyst is talking, these facts are already there, so that we are not here trying to play the blame game on the basis of memory, right? Well, you said this, and that's why I said this. So instead of trying to rely on the investigator or the analyst's memory alone, it's important to set up all those facts in writing, so that there's a trail and the breadcrumb of all that history of what is being discussed, so that at the point of the last conclusion, there is clarity. There's clarity in all the things that were discussed that led that discussion to a certain point. Because what ends up happening is discussions go in very different directions, and then you all come back and ask the question, well, why did we even fight? I don't even know, remember why I got mad at you after all, right? And that's why when you place everything on a board, it's not just about, having these boring graphs and charts in your hand, because let's face it, investigators like more of facts and story based type and more quick explanations of things. They don't like to read through paragraphs of details. They're already bogged down with so many reports, right? So it's important for us to quickly draw something up and then make sure that we are doing our part in articulating everything right, and to also not misunderstanding them as well as not being misunderstood. So it's equally important to stand up for yourself when you're being misunderstood, to have that healthy tone and healthy choice of words so that nothing's personal, and that we can refrain from arguments and stick to debate only. So I think a lot of them, because and often, some people may tie their identities with the roles they play, right? And that's why things get personal. The minute something is objectionable, it starts to feel like a personal attack. So it enables a person, when they're just sticking to the facts, to leave their personalities out of it and just talk about the facts at hand.
That first point you made is really something that more people need to think about, because I see a lot of departments, either through the CAR program or PSN or whatever, they bring in an analyst for the first time, and then they decide that they want the analyst to be front and center, and so they have them go present to a patrol briefing. Or the really tough spot is they're at a large organization and they want them to come in and they want them to present to ComStat. So now you're putting them in a room with 5, 6, 10, 15 captain level positions or above. And it's like, is that really the best platform to start that relationship with?
Right.
Throw them out there into a group and say, all right, well, go put your charts up there and see what happens. Or are you setting them up for failure at that point? That's a really interesting point.
Yeah, because obviously questions are going to be asked. If the worst part is when questions are not asked at all, the analyst has lost at that point. When there are absolutely no questions, and then someone who actually got them into the room comes then and tells them, "Okay, you did a great job." Well, how did you decide that it was great? Please explain why that was great.
Yeah.
Nobody asked me anything, right? So I think that when you're having that back and forth in a room full of people, it's important that everybody, it's unrealistic to keep an expectation that everyone will be of an open mind. So trying to keep a realistic ratio, even in the mind of the analyst, that if I'm going to be invited in a room full of 15 people, my success ratio will be based on, say, even 5 of them that I can get through. My angle is not to target everybody, but it's about getting through those 5. And to gradually keep repeating the process until it becomes a habit, right? So there are no expectations here. There is no plan when it comes to presenting. And that's why even critical thinking helps, because if an analyst wants to stick to a plan in a presentation, that plan will fail when these questions come up. Yeah. So I always, as a rule, it may sound weird, but I go unprepared for a presentation. Why? Because when I know my work very thoroughly, then it doesn't matter whether I planned the sequence or the order of facts at all. Then you ask me any question and I'll be able to answer, right? And that's exactly the mindset that the analyst should also be in. But what ends up happening is, in the sense of being perfect and in the sense of trying to follow a certain order and to present all these graphs, there is less opportunity for both the analyst and the investigator to do those deep dive type of conversations, because everyone's so focused on just the charts, but that's just the surface. That is not even critical thinking. It's just a representation of facts.
I think one of the things that I latched onto to what AK just said, and I just said this to the folks that I spoke at Fairmont State later last week, was that a lot of the educational background of what my generation and AK's generation was given didn't really foster that capability of thinking beyond the facts. I remember when I was and I relate a lot of things to parables and stories, and I do remember when I was in high school, my mom looked at me and went, "You're going to have to read Lord of the Flies your sophomore year." And she said this my entire freshman year. She kept complaining about the symbolism, demonology that played into it, and all these deeper meanings. My mom was very profound, is very profound. I was like, why didn't you go become a doctor or something? But when it came time to it, I read it my senior year, ultimately, and a lot of what we did was regurgitative discussion. It wasn't, let's expound upon what somebody was doing, let's talk about, the deeper meaning. No, it was just, Piggy got squashed with a rock. Spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read Lord of the Flies.
Pour one out for Piggy.
Yeah, pour one out for Piggy. But that feeds into a point that I've had. We're not fostered to do that anymore, and that's a big point of contention that I've had with younger analysts that have come into this field. Many folks go through their undergrad and maybe even their graduate school. They're not put in the hot seat. AK talks about being in that hot seat, so to speak. That's a really good crucible to put an analyst through, because yes, many of them are sufficient with being in a room, writing reports, and they go out. But that other duties as assigned aspect is we do have to get up and talk to folks. We do have to get up and explain our thoughts and explain why this theory holds water. We can't just get up there and regurgitate something that they already know. In your CompStat example, Charlie, 100%, you're not just going to get up there and tell them the facts, but also if you tell them something so groundbreaking that puts their own theories on its own head, you have to have that confidence based on your own fortified critical thought to stand on your own merits. That was AK and I's last conference appearance together, was talking about how you parlay critical thinking into building up intellectual confidence. That transposes into how you navigate your way through your agency, through tough situations and discussions. So I'm not saying the U.S. educational system has failed our students, but we definitely do them a little bit of a disservice by not making them look beyond the veil, cultivating that skill very early on. And unless you go to one of the big agencies, the Bureau has their school down in Quantico, the Bureau has that, but then the agency has Langley, it has the Kent School. If you go to one of the DoD entities, they have their own kind of schools. You don't really get that if you're going into a mom-and-pop crime agency, a state agency, or if you're a contractor. So you really have to read, something like AK and I have written to make these highbrow activities and, specialty kind of concepts that are innately what makes us human, how we navigate our lives. It makes it a little more approachable and kind of that, okay, I get that. I'm going to employ this because of reasons A, B, C, as opposed to, okay, I'm going to read about Bayesian theory. God help me if I have to use Bayesian theory.
I think it's profound that both of you have used the analogy of art. So Randy, you were just talking about literature. Akshata earlier, you used the analogy of art. I very famously started off as a film major. My career lasted about one semester.
Wow.
Nice. But one of my absolute favorite things that I will share with people whenever we want to talk about films is Red Letter Media. So Red Letter Media is just this guy who makes funny videos, and the one that really hooked me was he did a review of the Star Wars prequels. And for those of you who are not super nerds, the original Star Wars movies are considered some of the best movies ever made, and then 20 years later they made prequels, and they're considered some of the worst movies ever made. And so he kind of goes through these movies, and he puts on a class of what makes a good movie versus what makes a bad movie, and he uses the comparison of the prequels and the originals to kind of do that. And we don't really think when we sit there and watch a movie, I really like this movie because the director did this or that. We just kind of walk out and we say, I really like that movie or I really didn't. Analytical products and briefings are largely the same. We walk out of them and we say, oh my God, that was so terrible, it was so boring, or wow, I've really got ideas of where I'm going to go with this investigation. And so in those reviews, he says, don't just tell us that a bad guy is bad. Show Darth Vader walking in there and choking an innocent person to death. That's all the audience needs to say to go, oh, that guy's bad news. And so one of the things that one of my mentors did early on when I was learning analytics that I really think that we should do more of, and I think it's what you guys are talking on here, is we would look at an analytical product and he would say, is this good or bad? And we would say, oh, it's okay, or no, it's really not that good. And then we would say, why? Why is this bad? Why is this good? And we'd have to get into, well, it doesn't really get above the surface, or it doesn't display information very well, or it's way too big, and the point is here, and it shows us all this stuff. But it's really the same things that make literature or movies or art really, really good or really, really bad. Ultimately, your product has to speak to people, or it doesn't. And we talk a lot about how to use analytical tools, but we don't talk about that piece of it, and I think that's kind of what you're touching on here.
Hey, you know, if I could dovetail off that, Charlie, I like that. One, because I think Jason's heard me pontificate about this. AK certainly's heard all of my bad movie references. But I am a student of film. I love, cinema. But you raise an interesting point about, how the final product you may like, you may dislike. But was it the stylistic choices? Was it the presentation style? Was it their speaking? Or did you not agree with the objectivity of their truth, quote unquote, of the message of that analysis? I found one of the first briefings I went to, I had somebody who was coming up with the same kind of assessments I was related to the growth of militancy movements pre-Islamic State moving into Libya. But how they got that to that point, I didn't necessarily agree with. That's like going up to a Picasso and saying, man, I love the painting, but God, that breaststroke right here on this bottom page sucks. You're throwing baby out with the bathwater with the rest of the assessments. So I really like that. Also, with your theory about Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back is the best sequel ever made, and you can't fight me on it.
Possibly the best movie ever made.
Movie nerd, that Infinity War kind of touches that because Western audiences still aren't used to the bad guy getting away with it. We're not mature enough.
Well, I mean, Empire Strikes Back, the bad guys win in the end.
Hey, Thanos did nothing wrong, quote unquote.
I feel like we need to have a follow-up podcast episode to debate this. What's a better movie, Empire Strikes Back or Infinity War?
Absolutely.
AK, I think you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was just adding that it's also an art, because if you gave a paintbrush to a completely different person, and for example, you had 10 people and you asked them to draw an elephant, right? Each one's elephant is going to look different from each other. And that's the creativity required when you ask questions. And critical thinking may not just be about finding answers, but it's also about finding the right piece to match up with the other piece unimaginably. For example, you couldn't even think that a person involved in an auto theft ring could actually be a part of a human trafficking ring. To have these two pieces connected together is unimaginable, but it's a very true possibility, right? And it has happened, which comes off as a shock later. And so this is where those experiences and those years long of biases, they kind of default because nobody thinks like that. So when you ask a team of analysts to frame different questions or make up different connections, each one's connection is going to look different than the other. It's kind of like those science projects in school where you're given this circuit board and asked to put the red dots in the right places to create that light bulb effect, but everybody puts them in the different holes, and then some bulbs light up, some bulbs don't. But when the teacher goes and checks all of those boxes, everyone's connections are placed in a whole different pattern, right? So it's the same way why I call it an art.
I think one of the thoughts that has come to mind as you're talking about this is this idea that analysts often stop short of suggestions and recommendations. And I wonder if a good exercise would be actually start with a conclusion and then have the analysts create evidence that supports that conclusion. Because I think a lot of times you'll see presentations where the analysts will just talk about evidence and there's not necessarily that final conclusion. And I think it's I've just recently had to do this where I have a statement and then I got to come up with facts. I gotta come up with some evidence that proves the fact of the statement. And I think it's been a really good exercise for me, and so I would encourage other analysts to do that as well.
I agree with you, Jason. And in fact, there is a structured analytical technique that Randy and I discuss in the book, and that's about all those, testing out different assumptions, the key assumptions check, and the generating multiple hypotheses. So what you just said there is exactly right. When we do what if analysis, when you start from the conclusion and you go backward, and then you're trying to ascertain a story line where it led to that conclusion. There could be so many different ways, and you get the same test result. There's a running joke about engineers, right, where you give an engineer a problem to solve, and they would find literally every solution in the book to do it, but there's no one right solution. Everything works. There's only one efficient solution, one less efficient, one safer than the other, one not so safe, and there are all these gray areas in between. But there cannot be one way to do something, right? Or one reason that something happened. Like even you can take circumstances like Randy was mentioning with the 9/11 situation, right? I was not even here then, but I can tell that there are so many people in the intelligence community that have 100 reasons on why 9/11 happened. And all of them are right. All of them are right. So, but when it comes to doing that blame game, right, it's all about what someone else did wrong. And that's what, even as analysts, when you think jumping from the conclusion and then making a story back up, it also forces their hand to create imaginable consequences. But then it also forces that investigator to investigate more pieces of evidence that he didn't really look for, thinking that this is not relevant to my case. But in fact, it comes out to be relevant. Or not thinking that, okay, should I really interview that guy in the jail who I arrested, say, 5 years ago? What if he knows something about this technique? But the investigator is not going to think like that, It's the analyst's job to go and give him that idea that maybe you should, and then you'll know where this guy shops for his tools and techniques. Maybe you'll know where this guy's network is at, or why does he feel safe in committing this crime, or what is his risk and reward. That's how these type of questions come up.
So we are running a little low on time. So there is one really important question that I wanted to get in here. It's a little off topic, but I run into analysts all of the time who have a great idea and they want to write a book, or they want to create a class, or they want to start a podcast, or they want to do something, but it just seems so overwhelming to do it. And here you guys are, you're on the other side of having just published your first book. So you've gone and you've come up with a cover art, and you found a publisher, and you've got it listed on all of these different places. What advice would you give to the analyst who says, I think I've got a really good idea, maybe I've already done like a presentation like you guys did, but they're dealing with the mountain of small things they have to do to make it come to fruition. They're dealing with the imposter syndrome that comes along with it, like, who am I to write a book? What would you say to those analysts out there that are kind of on the fence about doing something like this?
AK, do you want to take a first crack at this?
Yeah. So for first-time writers, it's just try to develop a proper storyline on what you want to convey. For that person, even their own personal why in writing this should be clear. For example, it's not just about presenting facts and leaving it at that, right? For me and Randy, we started off with why is it important for us to write this book and why we want to do this. So publishing also comes with the confidence that your idea is going to be unique to you. So it doesn't matter that there are many other authors who have already written about it, but it's your perspective that matters. And then also finding enough research that you can back up with, to be able to articulate what you have in such a way that if someone had an opposing view, that you can easily accept that challenge and then incorporate that within your own study and then publish it, right? At the same time, I know publishing itself can be daunting, so to find someone who you can work with, collaborate with on that idea helps a lot. To jointly work as a team has been amazing with Randy, and I'm very grateful for him. And I'm lucky that I found a partner like him to co author this book with, because we bring the best of both in each other, and that's what the book came out to be. So that's really my take. And then having, honestly, researching different publishing platforms is all the technical parts of stuff. Like, if it's an analyst who's going to write about stuff, I'm pretty sure they're smart enough to find out, like, who is going to be the best to publish my work out there, right? This is so brand new for both of us, and I just took a dig at Google one day, and that's how I ended up finding up my publishing house. I didn't even know who to go with.
You made me feel all humble and nice because, a lot of good partnerships, they start off with, that same mission-centric kind of component. But if you can become buddies or friends with the person that you become a partner with in one of these endeavors, that's cherries to me. So I am greatly appreciative that, AK, and I'm not trying to do a self-aggrandizing thing for AK and I as people, but, AK is awesome because she did a lot of that research, aspect. Something that I would say, though, if you're new, if you're doing this without a partner, do not be afraid to, you have to give yourself a light deadline, but don't put such stringent deadlines on this. If you're writing, if it's a labor of love, and especially if it's your first time, self-publish, but don't put such a hard deadline on it that ultimately you're going to make it seem like work. One of the things, oh God, in between all of this, I moved, my wife had a big surgery, AK had a child. There was a lot of stuff that happened in between. A friendly discussion in Vegas about this, and then, a September, October 2024 publication. So don't put such a hard deadline on it. It seems like work. Get up, walk away, give yourself a fresh perspective on it. You know what that end goal is, but you don't want it to be haphazard, and you don't want whatever your product is that's going to be going to whomever, whether it's people in your field or folks that, ultimately have their own perspectives. You want them to read this, and you want it to be your best foot forward. So ultimately, give yourself a little bit of wiggle room, step away from it, and so on. But ultimately, she hit on everything else, the research aspect, finding a good publisher, especially if you're self-publishing it's your first book. The folks that we worked with were awesome. But that's all I got on that, because AK hit everything else on the head.
Well, guys, my Irish coffee here has officially run low. So I think that means it's about time to wrap it up. For everybody that's watching, once again, the book is called Rethinking Thought, a practitioner's guide to critical thinking and intelligence analysis. You can get it on Amazon, Google Books, Houghton Mifflin, Harcourt, McGraw-Hill Education, Streetlib, BookBaby, Blurb, Lulu. Some of these made up. Streetlib. You can get it anywhere at Barnes & Noble. That one, I know that one's real.
Wherever you buy books.
Wherever you buy books. For the academics out there that are putting together classes on intelligence analysis, it's a fantastic resource. And for intelligence analysts that are looking to grow and expand their career and develop some of those soft skills, it's highly recommended. Randy, Akshata, thank you for coming by, and we will see you all next month.
Congrats.
Thank you so much, Charlie and
Appreciate you guys.
Jason.
Congrats to you both.
See you. Bye-bye.